A very good evening. You're watching the press preview. It's a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. Time to take a first look at the headlines tonight with The Guardian's chief political correspondent Jessica Elgot and The Sun's political editor Harry Cole. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. We'll speak to them after we've had a look at some of those front pages, starting with The Eye, which describes the threat to Boris Johnson's political future as growing by the day, with speculation mounting that the number of letters of no confidence submitted may now be nearing the threshold to hold a vote on his leadership. The Guardian hears that the Prime Minister's shift towards more overtly right-wing policies in recent days is what's prompted the backbench unrest. Meanwhile, the Mail leads with concerns from ministers that the cost of living crisis has pushed the cost of filling the average family car with diesel to more than £100. According to The Telegraph, all but one police force in the country has missed its target of answering 90% of 999 calls within 10 seconds. The only force to succeed by that metric was Avon and Somerset. The Metro reports on massive airport queues over the half-term school holidays, delays which are expected to continue into the Jubilee weekend. In fact, it's also the lead story in The Times, which reports that the government is becoming increasingly angry with both airports and airlines. And the FT has a story about US microchip maker Qualcomm trying to buy a stake in its UK rival Arm. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you're watching and listening to us. And I'm joined tonight by Jessica Elgot and Harry Cole. Great to see you both this Monday evening. Lots to discuss. Harry, why don't we start with you? Front page of The Eye, Tory threat to Johnson growing by the day. A steady trickle now of Conservative MPs calling publicly for the Prime Minister to go, or certainly criticising him. How serious has the situation got?
Well, I think if Downing Street hoped that the Jubilee break, the half-term, whatever you call it, Whitsun, as they described it in Parliament, would have taken some of the sting out of that initial Sue Gray report drop, then I think they've slightly misjudged the mood, because I think a lot of MPs have gone back to their constituencies. They've had a look at the lay of the land. They've spoken to their associations. They've probably spoken to some people on the high street as well. And we've had a big debate today whether the drip, drip, drip is now indeed a trickle or a stream. But we have 26 Tory MPs, admittedly, out of 354, who are saying that they'd like a leadership vote now. Now, that's still some way off enough to topple the Prime Minister. And there was a sort of expectation that MPs have been saying openly now for many months. They'll wait for the Sue Gray report, they'll read it, they'll digest it, and then make up their mind. Now, lots of the people who have come forward and said it's time for a change of leadership are usual suspects. We've seen them before in other leadership coups of the Tory party of the last 6 years. They've deposed 3 prime ministers, the Mark Harpers, the Steve Bakers, the Andrew Bridgens of this world. But I think what will worry Downing Street is there are some sort of middle-of-the-ground names on that list, sensible former cabinet ministers who've gone, you know what, enough is enough now.
Yeah, and Jessica, it's interesting, isn't it, that when there was a vote of no confidence in Theresa May, only half of those letters had been publicly declared, if you like.
Yes, and I think that one of the things that some Tory MPs have told me is they feel actually very scarred by that experience of the Theresa May coup, where a lot of it was very public. There were, lots of journalists holed up outside meetings of the ERG where a lot of it was coordinated. You would see people brandishing letters in front of cameras, and people I know who've been considering putting a letter in have said that they certainly wouldn't necessarily go public with it again, having seen that experience of what happened to Theresa May. And of course, she won that vote of no confidence. I think that's a slightly different. I think that was a slightly different situation. It was a disagreement about policy rather than the kind of moral character of the Prime Minister. And also there was a big constituency to try and keep Theresa May in place because they just really didn't like what the alternative was. And I think one of the things that's really keeping Boris Johnson in place and staying in the hand of some letter writers is there is not that obvious candidate to take his place that they would feel comfortable with.
Yeah, Jessica, I'm going to stay with you because the next story is The Guardian, front page. The Guardian is saying the Prime Minister's sudden lurch to the right is fuelling anger of Tory rebels. I mean, tell me about that.
Yes, and I think that there's two things here. Firstly, that there was, I think, has been an attempt to try and particularly shore up that right of the party. Perhaps some of those who had a kind of growing unhappiness about the tax rises that Number 10, the Treasury, had put in, and also had a sort of lingering anger about lockdown. There's been quite a few attempts to shore up that support, including this new decision to override the parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and reviews of fracking, for example, which some Tory MPs were very noisy about. And now there's lots of other promises, including this return to imperial measurements, some hints at the return of grammar schools, and also this new move to tear up lots more of EU regulation. And some of that, I think, is probably maybe given some pause for thought, because they were grumbling that they didn't really think it was a Conservative government still. But I think amongst the kind of more sort of veteran Tories, perhaps ex-cabinet ministers, the sort of centrist wing, if there are any Cameroons left, that wing of a party, it feels to them, and they say repeatedly, like it's a government kind of out of ideas. I mean, if what we're talking about really is the return of the imperial measurements, then that really spooks some Tory MPs. I mean, we've even got some cabinet sources quoted in this piece who said call it absolutely bananas.
Yeah. OK. I want to get Harry's thoughts on that very quickly, and then I'll ask you what the whips are doing to prepare for a possible reaching of the 54-letter threshold.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's going to take more than pint glasses and weights and measures. In fact, we've got some detail on what they're actually going to be doing beyond that. I think the little Jubilee announcement that was trailed to the Sunday landed fairly badly, actually. And actually, I think it's a fairly minor part of some of the deregulations that we're going to be seeing in the coming weeks and months from a Brexit perspective. It feels to me like the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are gearing up to pronounce a pretty significant deregulation in the city that will allow insurance firms to essentially abandon quite strict EU rules that restrict the amount they can invest. Insurance firms can invest, because they have to keep a certain amount of capital in their accounts. That's all going to go on a bonfire, I suspect, in the coming weeks. A big speech on the economy, which I think we'll see the bizarre spectacle of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister giving a joint speech about the sort of next big bang for the city. So that could actually be proper red meat for the Brexiteers, proper red meat for the party, and proper red meat for the country that will make pint glasses look a little bit silly. OK, and Harry, front page of the Telegraph, the whips plot a lobbying drive should these 54 letters go in. Yeah, I mean, whips are always going to do whipping stuff. Number 10 are quite bullish still. The government are quite bullish still that if it does get to the 54 letters, they will win that 180 that is required for the 50% of the party plus one. Boris Johnson's not a man that's going to go just because he feels, he's lost a certain amount of face, should we say? I think he would have gone a while ago if that was the case. But it is a numbers game, and at the moment, the government payroll is so big. It's up to about 173, by my count, of associated ministers, bag carriers. Now, look, some of them will vote against the government, but there's still a healthy 50, I'd say, Tory backbenchers who support the Prime Ministers. So the odds are still in the Prime Minister's favour tonight that he would win that confidence vote. OK, Jessica, there are other hurdles to go, aren't there? I mean, there's talk that some MPs may be waiting till after the bank holiday weekend, after the Jubilee weekend, to put their letters in. We've got the parliamentary inquiry as well. Plus, we've got 2 by-elections. So, the Prime Minister has got a lot to be stressed about. Yes,
and of course, there are always going to be those MPs who always decide to put off the decision. I think that there's people who've said that they now have to wait until the end of the privileges inquiry because the thing that matters most to them is whether the Prime Minister has lied to Parliament or not. And others, are just brutally speaking, want to take a more, look at the electoral picture and see what happens in Wakefield and see what happens in Tiverton, where, Labour and the Lib Dems could win respectively. And I suspect, for many of them, that will be what the threat they see to their patch the most. Do they see it as Labour, regaining parts of the Red Wall, or do they see it as the Lib Dem regaining parts of the Southwest and or winning new ones? And I think the thing for those MPs who are worried about the Lib Dems is that Boris Johnson is really potentially the factor that's giving the Lib Dems hope. Maybe wouldn't be the same under a different Prime Minister. So I think that's one of the things that's really maybe convincing some of the leisure writers.
OK, we'll take a pause there. Coming up after the break, could we soon be paying £100 to fill up our cars? We'll be discussing that and more next. Welcome back. Part two of the press preview. Harry and Jessica still with us. Front of the Daily Mail, Jessica. I think we're all noticing this, aren't we, as motorists? Diesel now at £1.82 a litre, petrol at £1.72. The Mail saying, save us from the £100 tank of fuel.
Yes, and this story is essentially calling on ministers to further cut those fuel taxes, even after the cut that we saw earlier in the year, meaning that and the average is saying that average monthly fuel bills have gone up by at least £56 a month, which is a huge amount for people on low incomes and often people who are relying on their cars or vans to get to work, and diesel is particularly something that'll affect van drivers, and I think one of the things that, bigger picture that this shows is, we saw an enormous cost of living package from the Chancellor last week. And yet there are still places where, consumers still aren't really being shielded by the effects of huge soaring fuel prices. And it just shows how the government is struggling to keep people's heads above water.
Yeah, Harry, it also says here that the wholesale price of diesel is cheaper than the wholesale price of petrol, and yet diesel is more expensive at the pump than petrol, and they're sort of accusing service stations of ripping off the motorist. Is that fair?
Heaven forbid. It's totally fair. Obviously the Chancellor cut fuel duty at his spring statement. One of the few things he got right, I think, in that spring statement, much of which he's had to return to in his mini emergency budget, whatever you wanted to call it, last week. However, it is being gobbled up by many, not all, supermarkets and petrol providers, because it's just not being passed on. Now, we've heard lots of warm words from the government saying, it's time to pass it on. I think they're going to have to step in and act. We can only write so many letters before you start looking a little bit impotent. So something really does need to be done there. And don't forget, the more expensive the petrol gets, the more the Treasury is actually taking on VAT, because VAT is charged at a flat rate, and therefore the price goes up, they're going to get more money for it. So it's all very well making lots of noise and telling petrol providers to cut their costs. The Treasury are laughing all the way to bank on this one.
Yeah, and finally, let's finish with the front of the Metro. If people are deciding to leave their cars at home and head off to sunnier climes, it's miserable there as well, Jessica. The images we've been seeing from airports over the last few days have been so depressing.
Yeah, and astonishing. And also one of the saddest things about it is that this is the first half term, or maybe the first holiday, that a lot of people are going to have in many, in 2 years, in most. And that's one of the things, obviously, that's fueling this chaotic scenes at the airport. Lots of people have got vouchers to use. Loads of people have, been saving up through very difficult times through the pandemic to go on their first holiday in years, and they find themselves, waiting for 8 hours in a boiling hot airport, at the start of their half-term break. And it was some of it's a repeat of the scenes that we saw at Manchester Airport, where earlier in spring, where it was just complete chaos with no staff available, record vacancies, although they seem to, Manchester Airport still seem to be advertising rather low salaries for their bus drivers. But there is a chronic shortage of staff, across the industry, and it's very if I were the government, I'd be very worried about what, coupled with the passport crisis and passport wait, I'd be very worried about what summer holidays are going to look like.
Yeah, Harry, just a 10-second thought on this.
Yeah, look, it's an industry that went to the wall in the pandemic, literally, and you can't turn the engine on and expect it to leap back into life automatically. But it does feel to me like perhaps they could pull their finger out a little bit more.